My boss said lacked leadership after building his entire division. When Grant Mallory delivered that line, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look up from the folder on his desk. "Isabel, you're just not VP material," he said after years of using my work to keep his region afloat. It wasn't the insult that stunned me. It was the way he dismissed 15 years of results as if they were nothing, as if I'd stay quiet. But the truth he didn't see coming was already in motion, buried deep inside the systems only I fully understood. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you carried, stay with me. And if this hits home, subscribe and tell me in the comments. I didn't realize how much of myself I had poured into Redline Freight Systems until the day everything unraveled. When I first stepped into the Chicago headquarters 15 years ago, I was a junior analyst with a cheap laptop, a cubicle near the elevators, and a supervisor who barely remembered my name. Nobody expected much from me back then, and maybe that's why I worked the way I did. Quietly, persistently, determined to prove I was worth more than the entry-level title on my badge. Over the years, I became the person everyone called when the Midwest corridor threatened to fall apart. When a client panicked over a delayed rail car, when a storm shut down half the trucking routes between Milwaukee and Detroit, when a manufacturer's entire assembly line was minutes from stalling, I was the one who answered the phone. I built models, negotiated with carriers, rewrote routing plans, and redesigned the crisis protocols that pulled our region back from disaster more times than anyone cared to admit. It wasn't glamorous work. Operations rarely is. Most days felt like juggling sharp objects while people shouted about deadlines, shortages, invoices, and broken machinery. But I understood the rhythm of it, the way logistics breathes like a living thing, always moving, always demanding precision. I didn't just manage systems, I built ones that kept our delivery rate at 98% during years when other carriers collapsed under pressure. Yet for all that, what I was most proud of wasn't a metric or a performance report. It was the team I grew around me. People like Ethan, who came in as a temp but quickly proved he was sharper than half the senior coordinators. Or Brianna, the analyst who caught a multi-million-dollar forecasting error 1 week after joining my team. Or Victor, whose calm logic kept clients grounded during crises that would have sent lesser managers running. They weren't just co-workers. They were the backbone of our entire Midwest operation. We were a machine built from long nights, messy problems, and stubborn dedication. So when people asked why I stayed at Redline so long, the answer was never about loyalty to the company. It was loyalty to the people I fought beside, the ones who trusted me because they saw the hours I put in, the decisions I agonized over, the mistakes I owned, and the wins I shared. That's why the VP promotion mattered. Not because of the title, but because it meant I could finally protect the team that had carried me as much as I carried them. For 2 years, I was told I was next, that my name was at the top of the list, that leadership simply needed the right timing. And I believed it, because believing it made the grind feel like it had a purpose. Every crisis I averted, every system I rebuilt, every client I saved was fuel for the future I was promised. I didn't know then that the future had already been handed to someone else. I didn't know that while I worked to make Redline stronger, certain people worked quietly to make sure I stayed exactly where they needed me. Essential, reliable, and conveniently invisible. I walked into Grant Mallory's office that Friday afternoon, carrying the same binder I'd updated every week for 2 years. The binder that held the plans, projections, and restructuring models he'd asked me to prepare for my transition into the VP role. I'd rehearsed the conversation in my head during the elevator ride. Timelines, handoffs, new responsibilities, the subtle relief of finally stepping into the authority I'd quietly earned. Grant didn't look up when I stepped into the doorway. He just gestured at the chair with 2 fingers, still scanning a document with the kind of detached interest a man uses when he wants to make sure you know his time is more valuable than yours. I sat, waiting for him to start the meeting he'd scheduled himself 3 months earlier, with the subject line, "Finalize VP Transition Plan." Instead, he closed the folder with a soft thud and said, "Isabel, I need to realign expectations about the VP position." Realign expectations. That phrase alone punched harder than shouting ever could. I felt the air shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet, unmistakable way you feel just before something breaks. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. After careful consideration, I've decided the VP role is going to someone better suited for leadership. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. Better suited? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Grant, I've been preparing this transition for over a year. You approved every stage of it. He shrugged, a tiny lift of the shoulders so casual it felt insulting. It's nothing personal. It's about the future of the region. We need someone who can bring fresh strategic vision. I waited for the name even before he said it, because every instinct in my body was already bracing for impact. We're moving forward with appointing Tyler, he said. His nephew, 29, barely 3 years in logistics. The same man who once asked me what the difference was between a consignee and a consigner. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression still. You're giving him the VP position, I repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation of the reality I was now expected to accept. He has potential, Grant said, as if that were enough to erase everything I'd built, every crisis I'd solved, every year I'd devoted to strengthening the very systems Tyler had never even touched. And more importantly, he added, I can mentor him in ways I can't mentor you. Mentor him. That was the justification. Not skill, not expertise, not results, bloodline, legacy, control. I held his gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me fold. So what happens to the plans you asked me to create? I said. His lips curved, not into a smile, but into something smugder, something that told me he believed this was all perfectly reasonable. You'll continue supporting the division, he said. Your role is critical, but VP material, it just isn't you. That last sentence landed with the cruel precision of a man who'd rehearsed it. He wasn't making a business decision. He was delivering a dismissal wrapped in professional language. 15 years of results condensed into 5 dismissive words. It wasn't even the betrayal that cut the deepest. It was how effortless it was for him, how certain he seemed that I'd just nod, swallow the humiliation, and return to my desk to keep holding together the very operation he was handing to someone who didn't know how to run it. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something with chilling clarity. He genuinely thought I had nowhere else to go, that I was trapped by loyalty or fear or habit, that I would keep giving and giving because that's what I'd always done. But while he talked, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not shock. Something colder, more precise. A silent understanding that the version of me he expected to walk out of his office no longer existed. He'd mistaken quiet dedication for powerlessness. He'd mistaken my loyalty for dependency. He had no idea what that mistake was about to cost him. I walked out of Grant's office without saying anything else, not because I didn't have words, but because none of them were worth giving him. The hallway felt colder than usual, and for a moment I wondered if anyone passing by could see the shift happening inside me, the quiet severing of something I'd held onto for years. I reached my desk, closed the door behind me, and sat there staring at the binder I'd carried into that meeting. The same binder that had once felt like a symbol of progress now looked like evidence of how naive I'd been. I didn't touch my computer right away. I just breathed, letting the humiliation settle into something sharper. Grant thought I would absorb the blow, pretend nothing happened, and keep running the Midwest operation like I always had. That was the part that stung the most. Not the betrayal, but the assumption that I didn't know my value. Eventually, I opened my laptop. Not to rebuild a routing plan, not to answer client emails, not to check reports. I opened it to update my LinkedIn status for the first time in 5 years. Open to new opportunities wasn't a declaration of quitting, it was a declaration of awakening. I had barely saved the changes when the messages began trickling in. Recruiters I'd ignored for years, former colleagues who'd moved on to better roles, industry contacts who had always said, if you ever want something new, call me first. Their names flashed across my screen one after another, and with each notification, Grant's decision felt smaller and smaller. But one message stopped me cold. It wasn't a recruiter. It wasn't a former coworker. It was from someone I'd never expected to hear directly from. Lauren Sato, Chief Operating Officer of Arcadia Freight. Subject line, "Your work speaks for itself. Let's talk." I clicked the email so fast it felt instinctive. Her message was short, direct, and very unlike the careful corporate niceties I'd grown used to. "Isabel, I've been watching Redline's Midwest performance for months. Your name keeps coming up from multiple sources. I'd like to discuss a leadership opportunity with you. This weekend, if possible. Lauren." My hands went still on the keyboard. Arcadia was Redline's fiercest competitor in the region, and their growth over the last 3 years had been nothing short of explosive. For someone like Lauren to reach out personally meant she already knew exactly what Grant had chosen to overlook. I didn't hesitate. I typed a reply that felt like a door opening in my life. "Lauren, I would welcome the conversation. I'm available Saturday morning." When I hit send, a strange calm settled over me. Not relief, not anticipation, something steadier, like the ground had stopped shifting under my feet for the first time in years. At 4:19 p.m., just as the office began thinning for the weekend, Ethan messaged me. "Heard something weird. Did Grant really pull your promotion?" I stared at the screen, unsure how word had traveled so fast but not surprised. Nothing stayed quiet in logistics. "Yes," I replied. "He's giving it to Tyler." The typing dots appeared instantly. "That's insane. You built this place. If you leave, tell me first. I'll follow you anywhere." I sat back, letting that sink in. Ethan wasn't the kind of person who said things lightly. If he felt the ground shifting too, that meant others did as well. 10 minutes later, Brianna sent a text. "I'm so sorry, you deserve better. If you're considering other options, please keep me in the loop." Then Victor messaged, "If leadership doesn't value you, they don't value the team either." It hit me then. My choice wouldn't just change my life. It would shake the entire foundation of the division. Grant thought only the title mattered. He forgot about loyalty, not the blind kind he counted on, but the real kind that grows from respect, trust, and shared battles fought in the trenches. He thought taking the VP role from me would keep me small, but all he'd done was expose how big my impact really was. I closed my laptop at 6:03 p.m., knowing exactly what I needed to do next. The version of me he expected to find at her desk Monday morning no longer existed. I was done waiting for permission to step into the role I'd already been living for years. He thought he'd stopped my future, but all he did was free it. I arrived at Arcadia Freight's headquarters early Saturday morning, long before the sun had fully pushed through the gray Chicago sky. The building itself felt different from Redline's, sleek, open, pulsing with a kind of quiet energy that comes from people who know exactly where they're going. I checked in with security, rode the elevator up to the executive floor, and stepped out into a lobby flooded with natural light. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking in the unfamiliar sense of possibility hovering in the air. When the doors to the conference room opened, Lauren Sato greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that told me she hadn't invited me here out of courtesy. "Isabel, thank you for coming in on such short notice," she said, motioning for me to sit. "I've heard your name for years, but the last few months made it impossible to ignore." She began outlining Arcadia's expansion strategy, new rail partnerships across the Midwest, a modernization push for routing intelligence, and a glaring need for someone who not only understood the region, but had actually shaped it. She spoke clearly and without condescension, something I hadn't experienced from an executive in years. "I'll be direct," she said at last. "We want you to lead our network optimization division, full autonomy, VP level, immediate start." Just like that. No hoops, no vague promises about future potential, no moving goalposts, no strategic ambiguity meant to keep me waiting. She laid a folder on the table. Inside it was the offer: salary, equity, relocation package, performance incentives, all spelled out with the confidence of a company that already understood my worth. "We've reviewed the operational improvements credited to Redline's Midwest performance," she continued. "Anyone can implement templates. What you built wasn't a template, it was vision." I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until she said those words. At Redline, my work had always been labeled as support, even when it carried entire quarters. Here, someone saw it for what it truly was: leadership. Why now? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Lauren leaned back, folding her arms with quiet certainty. Because we know Redline won't hold together without you, and we don't want your talent trapped under someone else's ceiling. Come here, and you'll build something of your own. Hearing her say it out loud felt like someone gently placing a mirror in front of me. I saw not the version of myself Redline had compressed into a manager's title, but the version I had been all along, the one who never needed Grant's permission to lead. I thought briefly of Ethan, Brianna, and Victor, of the messages they sent Friday evening, of how each of them recognized a future that I'd been too cautious to claim for myself. When I looked up, Lauren was waiting patiently, as if she already knew what decision had taken shape inside me. If I say yes, I said slowly, I'm not coming alone. Her eyes sharpened with interest. Good, she replied. The strongest leaders never do. And just like that, the path forward became undeniable. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, no lingering loyalty to a company that had chosen politics over merit. I signed the offer before leaving the building. As the pen left the paper, something inside me settled. A quiet, steady certainty that the life I'd been waiting for was finally within reach, and Grant had just handed me the reason to take it. When I walked into Arcadia on Monday morning for my first official day, the city still felt half asleep, but my phone was already buzzing with notifications. I hadn't even reached my new office when the first forwarded resignation email from Redline appeared in my inbox. It was from Ethan. The timestamp read 8:12 a.m., less than 30 minutes into the workday. Effective immediately, he'd written, I will be transitioning out of my role. Thank you for the opportunities. No mention of Grant. No acknowledgement of Redline's leadership. Just a clean break. I didn't have time to process it before a second email notification popped up. This one forwarded from a friend still inside Redline. Brianna's resignation, time-stamped 8:39 a.m. Then at 9:04, Victor's notice arrived. 3 resignations in under an hour. 3 core people Redline's entire Midwest infrastructure depended on. 3 people Grant assumed were too loyal, too comfortable, too tied to the stability of routine to ever walk away. And all 3 were already headed toward the future he thought he'd denied me. By 9:30 a.m., my phone lit up with an incoming call. Grant. I watched the screen vibrate on my desk, the name flashing like a warning siren. I let it ring once before answering. Isabel, he said, breathless, without even a greeting. Did you know 3 of your people resigned this morning? Grant, I said calmly. They're not my people anymore. You made that clear on Friday. Is this you retaliating? He demanded. Are you pulling them away from the company? His panic bled through every syllable. No, I said. What they choose to do with their careers is their decision. Don't play games, he snapped. 3 senior staff gone in a single morning doesn't just happen. It does, I replied, when leadership shows them what their future looks like. Silence stretched over the line, thick and unsteady. Where are you? He finally asked. I'm at Arcadia, I said. In that moment, the line went so quiet I wondered if he'd disconnected. You left? He whispered, as if he still thought I'd be sitting at my Redline desk waiting for him to change his mind. I accepted a VP role, I said, on Saturday. He exhaled sharply, like someone had punched the wind out of him. We can talk about reconsidering, he said quickly. If it's about the title... Grant, I interrupted. It's about the 15 years you reduced to nothing. You're overreacting, he insisted. This situation can be fixed. It already is, I said, and ended the call. For a few minutes, the room felt impossibly quiet. Not peaceful, more like the moment after a storm breaks, when the world is still deciding what to do with the damage. But the silence didn't last long. At 10:11 a.m., another email arrived. The first major client in the Detroit corridor had called Redline, demanding an emergency performance review. By noon, several colleagues at Redline were messaging me directly, each story more chaotic than the last. Nobody knows who handles the routing sheets now. Grant is trying to assign work he doesn't understand. We've got trucks sitting idle because approvals aren't going through. 2 more people are talking about leaving. I sat back in my new office chair, absorbing every message with a mix of disbelief and inevitability. I hadn't planned any of it. I hadn't encouraged it. But I understood exactly why it was happening. People don't leave companies. They leave the leaders who show them their careers don't matter. And Grant had shown them that in the clearest way possible when he reassigned the VP position to someone who had never earned it. By late afternoon, the news reached Arcadia through unofficial channels. A director leaned into my doorway and raised an eyebrow. "Whatever's happening over there," he said, "looks like it's going to be a long week for Redline." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because by then, something had become undeniable. Grant's biggest mistake wasn't stealing my promotion. It was believing the people who kept his division alive would stay standing behind him after he did. By Tuesday morning, Arcadia's analysts were already forwarding me industry chatter that mentioned Redline's unusual activity, a polite way of saying their operations were spiraling. I hadn't expected things to unravel so quickly, but once the first cracks formed, everything else followed the pattern I'd seen for years whenever a weak leader tried to paper over structural problems with empty authority. By late morning, someone still inside Redline sent me a screenshot of a routing disaster unfolding across the Chicago-Detroit corridor. A time-critical shipment had been left sitting in a Joliet yard because nobody remaining knew how to release the rail interchange approvals. That process used to run through Ethan. Now it ran through nobody. The client issued a formal complaint before noon, invoking penalty clauses that would trigger a review of the entire quarter. I could picture the chaos without having to be there. The frantic emails, the heated calls, the desperate attempts to reassign tasks to coordinators who barely understood their own workloads. For years, I'd been the one to catch these failures before they landed. Now there was no one left who could. By Wednesday, 2 more coordinators resigned, and word spread that Grant had hired an emergency consultant who charged more per week than some coordinators earned in a month. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same man who insisted I wasn't VP material was now paying someone else 3 times my former salary to explain systems I'd built myself. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't feel guilty. Choices carry consequences, and Grant had made his with full confidence I would quietly accept it. On Friday, 1 week to the day since he reassigned my promotion, Redline's on-time performance across the region dropped below 90% for the first time in 8 years. The domino effect hit faster than anyone anticipated. Missed deliveries triggered additional audits. Audits triggered account escalations. Escalations triggered legal reviews. One of the remaining supervisors messaged me privately. "It's like someone cut the power to the whole division. Every switch we flip leads nowhere." I didn't reply. Some truths don't need commentary. By the start of week 2, client complaints hit levels I'd never seen during my 15 years there. Carriers were refusing expedited requests because nobody at Redline could provide reliable turnaround times. Dispatchers were making decisions based on outdated schedules. Even the automated systems were spitting out errors because no one knew how to update the forecasting templates I had designed. And through all of it, Grant was still trying to act as if the bleeding could be controlled. He scheduled emergency meetings, reassigned responsibilities to people already drowning, and issued vague memos insisting that leadership is actively addressing temporary disruptions. Temporary, that word carried the kind of denial only a man in free fall could cling to. By day 14, 5 more employees had walked out. By day 16, Redline lost 2 major Detroit accounts. By day 19, word spread across the industry that the Midwest Division was entering operational crisis review, which was corporate language for one step before collapse. I read those reports from my office at Arcadia, surrounded by people who understood exactly why things had unfolded the way they had. Talent doesn't break when you push it aside. It breaks the system that took it for granted, and Redline, under Grant's leadership, was learning that truth the hardest way possible. 1 year later, I could still trace the exact moment everything changed. Grant leaning back in his chair, telling me I wasn't VP material. It was almost funny now, how confidently he'd said it, how certain he'd been that I would shrink under his judgment. But by the time 12 months had passed, the only thing shrinking was Redline's footprint across the Midwest. From my office at Arcadia, a corner space overlooking the river, sunlight pouring across the desk, I watched our expansion numbers climb month after month. We'd secured 7 new manufacturing accounts, including 3 that had been with Redline for more than a decade. Not because we undercut them, not because we offered flashy incentives, but because once I came on board, clients suddenly had someone who understood the operational heartbeat of the region down to its smallest pulse. People trusted stability, and they could see exactly where it lived. Meanwhile, Redline's leadership reshuffled so many times that even industry insiders struggled to keep track. Grant's email signature changed twice before he disappeared from the corporate directory altogether. No announcement, no farewell memo, just a quiet erasure, the kind companies use when they want to rewrite history without acknowledging the disaster that forced their hand. Rumor had it he'd been offered a strategic reassignment months earlier, which was the polite way of saying they needed him gone without making shareholders panic. And even that hadn't been enough to steady the sinking ship. The most surreal moment came when the Journal of Freight and Operational Strategy published a 50-page case study titled Leadership Miscalculations and the Collapse of a Regional Network. It didn't name me directly, but it didn't need to. Anyone who knew the Midwest corridor could read between the lines. The decision to sideline key operational leadership, it stated, triggered a cascade of failures that exposed systemic dependence on unrecognized internal expertise. Unrecognized internal expertise. I read that phrase 3 times. For years, that's exactly what I had been. Unrecognized, uncredited, expected to hold up the entire operation without ever needing the authority to match the responsibility. Now my work wasn't just recognized, it was studied, discussed, taught. Arcadia even asked me to speak at our leadership summit, and standing on that stage, looking at the faces of managers who genuinely wanted to learn, I realized how far I had traveled from that Friday afternoon where Grant dismissed 15 years of work with a single sentence. And the best part wasn't the promotion, or the salary, or the respect, though all of it mattered. The real vindication was watching my team thrive. Ethan was now overseeing one of Arcadia's key corridor integrations. Brianna had built forecasting models that corporate used nationwide. Victor had just been promoted into a role that allowed him to mentor new hires the way I once mentored him. They weren't struggling, they weren't overlooked, they weren't stuck. They were blooming in soil that actually nourished them. That, more than anything, was the ending Grant never saw coming. He thought denying me a title would keep his world intact. Instead, he detonated the very foundation he relied on. And somewhere between Redline's collapse and Arcadia's rise, I stopped thinking about what he took from me and started appreciating what he accidentally gave me. The push I needed to build a future no one could take away again. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's that waiting for someone else to recognize your worth is the slowest path to losing yourself. For years, I believed patience would be rewarded, that hard work naturally rose to the top, that loyalty meant something. But the truth is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Some leaders don't want you to rise. They want you to stay exactly where your effort benefits them the most. When Grant told me I wasn't VP material, he thought he was defining my ceiling. What he actually did was expose the cage he'd built around me, and the moment I saw it, I walked out. I share this because so many people write to me asking what they should do when a promotion keeps getting delayed or when someone in power keeps moving the finish line farther away. Here's my answer. Document everything. Believe actions over promises, and never let someone convince you that staying small is the safest choice. The moment I stepped into Arcadia, everything aligned. Not because I suddenly became more capable, but because I finally put my abilities where they were valued. If my story resonates, tell me your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. There's something I've come to understand only after living through it. Sometimes the biggest betrayals in life don't come from enemies. They come from people who quietly benefit from your loyalty. I spent years believing dedication would eventually be recognized, that working hard and staying patient was the honorable path. But what I learned is that some leaders will take everything you give and still ask for more, not because you're unworthy, but because your competence makes their life easier. Leaving Redline wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had handed over in the name of loyalty. And yes, Grant faced the consequences of underestimating me, but I didn't need to tear him down to win. His downfall came from his own choices. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't try to prove myself one more time. I simply walked away and life rearranged itself in my favor. If you're stuck in a place where your value is minimized, listen to the truth. Life is whispering to you. You don't need someone else's permission to rise. The market wants your talent more than the wrong boss ever will. Don't wait for a title to validate what your work already proves. If this story mirrors your own life, here's how to get started today. Write down every skill you've developed in the last 5 years. Update your resume or LinkedIn profile. Don't overthink it. Send one message to someone who left your company and ask how they knew it was time. Apply to 3 jobs without waiting for the perfect one. Small steps can move you out of places that no longer serve you. And if this spoke to something inside you, comment below and tell me your experience. Share this with someone who needs courage today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.